Hey guys, Veronica here. So I am back in California, back at the farm where I started all of this YouTube stuff several years ago. And it has been hot, it's been dry. If you've been following along on Instagram, you'll recognize this space behind me. If you haven't, this is the garden that I've pulled together since the end of June, trying to get a little bit of summer crop going. There's a little more stuff in the front, but today we're just gonna take a look around this space before I begin to rip everything out and transition it for fall, and see a few of the techniques I've implemented in order to grow a lot more in a very small amount of square footage in these raised beds. So let's check it out. One of the things you may notice in a lot of the gardens that I've done over the years is the plants keep getting closer together. Now all of this is really intentional. I don't like dealing with bare soil. I don't like dealing with having to squeeze mulch in between stuff to make sure that weeds don't happen. And so what I like to do instead of dealing with all of that is to just place plants a little bit closer together. Now we're not talking about like right on top of each other, same types of plants, because that doesn't actually work out to your benefit. Instead, what I do is work with the various layers of a container or even in the ground to grow in levels. So you'll see on the base level here, I have all of this purslane. This is volunteer. I can pull it out and it'll just take over the same spot again. That creates sort of my green mulch base layer. There's a couple of kale plants squeezed in here. It's not a summer vegetable, but given enough shade and the cool nights here, it does just fine. And then you'll see peppers kind of spread out throughout this bed. I like to do a nice centerpiece for pollinators. Here's a blue African basil. That's just something that the bees all flock to and then pollinate the surrounding plants as they go. And then of course various flowers. Alyssum, if you know alyssum, is a great pollinator flower as well. Low growing ground cover plant. So kind of squeezing those in to make sure that you don't see any bare soil. You don't need the additional mulch necessarily if you have the green mulch in place. And you're able to fit a lot more plants in a single bed. So in this bed I have, I think 6, 8 peppers going, as well as like 4 kale plants and a bunch of herbs and flowers. So just really building these mini ecosystems for everyone to enjoy, including us. Similar concept here. One thing that is different, obviously, is that I have these giant trellis arches to work with, which means even more real estate than just the bed itself. On the trellises, I have here there's watermelons and beans. There's cucumbers further down and other melons. There's kind of beans mixed in. I wasn't sure that the melons are going to survive because they were a little root bound in the greenhouse. And so I put some beans in, and now there's a competition happening, but I'm cool with that. More plants is better than less plants. You'll notice, again, that this is a lot of plants on top of each other in this bed. One thing that I would recommend as you go to pull out your summer garden and transition towards fall is as you're pulling these plants out, as they hit the end of their life cycle, if you haven't before, really take a second to stop and look at what their root system looks like. Now this is going to improve your game a ton because it's not just about how close plants can be together above the soil and how much light they need and airflow they need. So much of it too is about how much space they need below ground and which ones can go next to each other because of that. Once you start to understand what a plant's root system looks like, you'll start to understand which ones can really grow well together. It's not just companion planting, it's also nice neighbor planting, I suppose. Who's going to take up how much space and what? So in this space we have everything from this amaranth that was a volunteer. There's sweet potatoes, which are just cascading over this bed. There's a couple of tomatillos, as I said, some melons, some beans, a few peppers squeezed in between because there's never enough space for peppers, and some ginger there in the back. Now I can plant all of these things in this small of a space with confidence because I know what their root systems look like underground, and I'm able to imagine what that looks like when they're this close together. So this amaranth here can be right next to and almost on top of the sweet potatoes because the amaranth actually has a really deep taproot system and maybe a few side roots, but doesn't tend to take up a lot of real estate underground. Now sweet potatoes are a different story because obviously they're a tuber, so they're going to take up a ton of space underground. You don't really want to plant anything on top of them because it's not going to compete, or if it does, you won't get good sweet potatoes. With things like the peppers, we can squeeze them in between because they tend to stay sort of in their own zone. They'll obviously get, kind of wider anchoring systems if given the opportunity, but they also like to dive deep. And then melons and beans and squash tend to have, or at least the climbing varieties, they tend to have a little bit more of a shallow root system in our soils here. So lots of kind of branching out feeder roots, maybe a couple of tap roots, but they're not going to outcompete, say, this pepper here that's next to them. On the other end, with the ginger, same story. You really don't want to plant a bunch of stuff on top of it, but you can go nearby it with something that has a tap root, as long as it's not something that has roots that are spreading and feeding. So as you're pulling out your tomatoes, your peppers, your melons and squash and cucumbers, really take a second to stop and look at those root systems. If you've never looked at them before, I wouldn't say pull every single one out, because obviously the goal here is to chop and drop and disturb as little soil as possible. But if you've never looked at a root system before, now's the time, as you start to move towards fall, to really pull out a couple of plants and go, okay, like this doesn't actually grow a lot of roots. I can put it next to this next time. Or, whoa, this grows a ton of roots. I shouldn't put anything nearby. Let's go look at the other arches, because I'm really proud of those, because I was able to get them to grow all the way across the top in less than 3 months now. And as promised, here are the other arches. I have to get on a ladder in order to weave those top pieces in. But you'll see right around here we have melons, we have Armenian cucumbers. There's just stuff that's been growing like crazy for the last few months. I gotta tilt this up so you can see that arch. I was very, very stoked that that actually worked out. One thing I will say about sort of these arch trellises and any vertical trellises in general is that you may need to do a little bit of weaving work with your plants in order to get them to attach to the arch, but what you get from doing that really makes up in terms of not having a lot of disease or mildew issues on your plants, as well as being able to see the things that you want to pick and harvest. And when they're ready, you're able to spot insects pretty easily. You get a really nice shade tunnel to hang out in sometimes. And you'll see there's just some really big ones now that I'm starting to let go to try and save some seeds from them. Yeah, I'm a big fan of the arches just because it gives me my bed back. I don't have to figure out, how to let things hang off down the sides, especially with dogs running around, trampling everything. Like, you really want to be able to grow up and over like this. On the flip side of that trellis, similar vibe as to the other bed that I showed you. Lots of tomatillos, sweet potatoes, there's ginger on the other end, there's peppers in between. While a lot of these beds kind of look like a jungle, there is a method to the madness. There's a bit of a pattern that I have going on based again on the root depth and needs of each plant. And so I put some lighter feeders next to some heavier feeders, some things that will attract pollinators next to things that struggle to attract pollinators, and just sort of mix those plants in, again, to create a sense of pattern, to create a little more stabilized, manufactured ecosystem, essentially, and really give us a shot at growing a lot of food in a very small space without it being this constant, really tight maintenance situation, but also allowing space for chop and drop, allowing space for plants to fail and something else to sort of take over that space if a plant fails. It's a lot less stressful way to garden, to be honest. So I really love doing it this way and seeing, when you're putting in all of these plants, for the most part, were overflow. They were in the greenhouse that didn't really have a great ideal home picked out. And a lot of the other gardens I used to work on here need a ton of soil work before they can really get up and running again. So it just made sense to focus on getting all of those greenhouse plants into these 6 beds and a little more space I've created here. And then focus on the soil work that needs to be done so that we can really go for the following season in the much larger spaces, which we'll be covering at some point in the near future. So yeah, this is just, I like the way that this works, and I like being able to plug in things that are struggling and see them start to flourish, like these tomatillos here. Just really impressive and wild. If everything again survives, then you have a lot of plants to deal with and you make decisions. And If it doesn't, then there's space for the plants that might be a little too close to spread out even further. So I just wanted to show you this bed really fast, this nice long, one of the only in-ground beds. This soil in here has always been a little bit silty and a bit of a struggle, but I forked it and amended a little and planted potatoes. Then a dog dug them up. Then I replanted them. Also transplanted in a few Swiss chards that needed to be rehomed, and did a whole bunch of a summer cover crop mix called a milpa mix that has squash and beans and corn and various grasses and grains and flowers. And I'm excited to see what comes out of this, because right now it just looks like a jungle. So if you ever have a bed that's struggling, that just you don't know what to put in it, that maybe it's in a weird spot where it's like mostly shaded like this is, I highly recommend trying a cover crop mix, especially with edibles mixed in, because this has been really fun to watch develop as the season goes. All right, the sun is not being wildly cooperative, but we're doing the best we can. So here's another pepper bed. Again, these are getting ready to transition. You'll notice there's not as much purslane in this. I actually chopped a lot of it out to mulch a different bed, and it was covered like that first one I showed you. Was looking at planting a cover crop or just a crop of greens or something around these peppers, but decided not to. Just leaving sort of that chop and drop mulch instead. Lots of purslane seeds in this mix, and getting ready to harvest all of these peppers and then remove the plants and then just rotate the bed completely. Again, there's a couple of kales in here. The centerpiece in this one did not quite grow through, but it is a pineapple sage that will get some size sooner or later. And there's also comfrey on the ends of these beds. So again, repeating patterns across. It's a great plant to have for mulching. That middle bed that you can kind of see in the background has been squash, like summer squash, zucchini style, bush varieties for the most part in that space. And that will be coming out shortly as well, but we just wanted to let them go a little bit longer to try and save some seeds, see what pops up from them next year. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much, there's 6 of these giant metal stock tank containers full of soil, hugelkultur style, because that's how I operate, always bearing the rotten wood to help both take up space and also just get that soil cycle really going inside of a container. This is the squash bed that I mentioned over there. As you can see, there's still squash in it. At the very far end there's an Italian zucchini variety, and that was here when I got here, as well as an 8-ball squash that's no longer here because it died. But they both were really productive. When I got here, they were like tiny stunted plants, and I basically made the decision, rather than pulling them out, to just try and aerate under them with a fork, as well as around the soil surrounding them, because a lot of times plants look stunted because the roots are not able to effectively penetrate the soil below them. In heavy clay soils like this, it is usually the case, and so my go-to, rather than looking at a plant and being like, oh, it needs food, is, oh, it needs more oxygen at its root level. So I'll put a fork in there, kind of pop it up here and there, not completely detach the plant from where it's growing, but just give it a little bit more points of entry for water and oxygen, so that that rhizosphere and all of the microbes that live in it can really get going a little more easily, versus having to fight these like really compacted aggregate layers of clay that there's nowhere for them to go in between. So I did that, forked under those plants. They took off. As you can see, it's cascading down the side. I'm at the point where I am letting those size up sizably, like really big, go to seed, maybe save some seeds from them. Might have crossed with a few of these second round of planting Palestinian summer squash, but probably not, because all other flowers are just really densely under those leaves. So I mean, we'll see. Like, maybe we'll get a mix. I don't know, but it's a nice one. The Italian one's a nice one to have because it's really productive. And these guys have been nice to have too, because they're really just like tender and sweet summer squash. They don't have the bitterness that a lot of, I find, like the crooknecks and hybrids and like super productive bush squash varieties tend to have. Like, there's not that bitterness in these Palestinian varieties. Starting to see some incidents of insect damage as well as powdery mildew, so I take that as an indicator from nature. with the temperatures changing and the fog rolling in the mornings, that it is getting close to time to rotate them out. So I'll do a little bit of treatment here and there, but for the most part, I'm not going to fight against like the ecological indicators of what my garden is trying to tell me. And these are all going to come out soon. I can really do some nice soil magic in this bed and then get some fall and winter crops going. Now these barrels of potatoes are the real reason I'm filming today. I want these barrels for carrots. But I told myself I couldn't dig the potatoes until I filmed, because once I dug the potatoes, I would just start ripping apart this whole garden and there would be no record of it. So I want these barrels for carrots because I actually built the soil that's inside of them. It's a mix of some of the screened compost here that I very intensely screened for rocks, as well as some really good fluffy amendment mix, like a decomposed wood chip mix that I got at the hardware store. And so these potatoes have been super happy in that because it's nice and light and fluffy and they can just kind of push roots out everywhere. That makes sense to also use for carrots because they want to be able to push easily without having to like fight to get the roots down. So yeah, these are going to rotate out soon. I have 3 barrels of potatoes, and then I also, like I said, have some back in that milpa mix somewhere underneath, and then there's one more potato bed that I'm going to show you guys, and then I'm going to get to work in this space so that we can start rotating fall stuff in. Okay, the last bed I am going to show you guys today, and I have this larger one as well as a smaller one, are these cinder block beds. So I had still a ton of potato seed that was in overflow and I needed a spot to put it, and putting it in individual containers doesn't make sense to me because then you have to water every single container and they dry out because it's really hot, and I just wanted it kind of one and done. So I took cinder blocks from a pile of them we just had sitting on the side of the house and decided to build a temporary bed that's about the same footprint as the metal beds and just see, like, could stuff grow decently in there. Did the same amendment mix that I did in the wine barrels for potatoes, and then actually planted in every single little hole just various things. Flowers, there's a couple of melons, there's a couple of eggplants, there's a squash, and just seeing, you know, what's going to do well. So this is actually doing pretty well. I think it'd be hard to get a better bang for your buck in terms of a raised bed cost for effectiveness than cinder blocks. So while they're not beautiful, like, they are really effective and work well. This is all tied into drip irrigation, so it's not like crazy maintenance. And the potatoes in the middle are doing better than I expected them to. I think this concrete of the cinder blocks and that additional soil there really insulates nicely. So that's pretty much it for today. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the questions below. If you like what you see, hit that subscribe button, ding that bell. We are going to be getting back into the swing of things, and I will be covering basically what the journey has been to get back here in the very near future. But first, I just wanted to make sure that I covered this before I start tearing it apart for the next season. If you want to know what's going on in between all of the videos, follow me on Instagram at FlavorKit. And until next time, happy gardening.